I thought before we concentrated all our efforts on discovering Warminster, I'd take one last look and walk along the bank of the River Wylye. And here we are. And I'm making my way along it until it goes away to my left, and I'll go to my right over a bridge and into a country park that stretches from here all the way into the centre of Warminster. Spalbrook Meadows Country Park it's called. It's administered again by the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, and I think you'll find it fascinating. It used to be water meadows once, and a farm, Spalbrook Farm. It's a most pleasant, interesting, visually appealing yet surprising park to find so near to the centre of such an extremely busy country town, containing as it does an abundance of wildlife, and I hope it is appreciated, for it is a great credit to the Wiltshire Trust for nature conservation. The town, it is quickly obvious, suffers from the modern disease that is destroying so many rural centres, an epidemic of vehicles, so packed together it becomes impossible for the visitor to even try and view the architectural possibilities of Warminster. The town hall is used today as a magistrate's court, and I do hope it is not as dilapidated and grime-covered inside as it is out. The entrance steps, it is said, are exactly the same height above sea level as the top of Salisbury Cathedral spire, which gives some idea of the climb we have made upwards since leaving Wilton. Local resident Jack Fields has a deep knowledge of his town of Warminster and talks of it with love. Jack Fields, it's not difficult looking down on Warminster from here to realise why the town was built there in the first place, is it?
Yes, you can see from the contours and the valleys that come to rest here why the settlement came down below, and of course the early settlement, as far as we know, would have been the Saxon one down by the parish church.
How did it grow, Jack?
It really became a centre for the corn trade. In fact, it was, I believe, one of the biggest corn centres, well, certainly in the West Country, next to Bristol. So that's really how it prospered. Yeah.
Cobbett said it was a very honest corn centre as well.
Well, that's right. If you go down into the town, you'll see the colonnaded front of the old bell. Well, this is where they used to pitch the corn on for people to see it out of the bags. They weren't sold by samples, they were sold by the actual stuff being shown to the customer.
We hear a lot about the corn trade in Warminster, but not quite so much about the woolen industry which was there. How large was that, Jack?
Well, the woolen industry really was, I suppose one would term it, basically average for this area. We've made our mark really in a modest sort of way, if you like.
Some of your finest houses were built for
well, yes, the
wool traders, weren't they?
The clothiers were pretty successful, I'd say. They did, in fact, live a fairly comfortable life, and they did build quite nice houses in the town which are still there.
What kind of a town is it to live in today, Jack? What's it like?
Well, for me, it's a super town. A, because, of course, I spent my childhood here. I think the thing that strikes one more than anything about it is its surroundings. I mean, at the moment, we're at the mercy of the vehicles that go through it. but thank goodness we're about to have the opening of a bypass, which is going to make the centre of town much more quiet and much more enjoyable. You'll be able to have conversation there at long last.
And believe you me, it really is awful. It's destroying the town, and the quicker they get that bypass built, the better. And I should think particularly for people who want to come and visit this chapel of ease, chapel of rest. It was founded in the 13th century by the Mordaunt family. They were lords of the manor of Warminster, but it's always been financially supported by the town, and the salary of the priest was paid for by the people of this town. And they kept it and maintained it until Henry VIII and Edward VI, when during the destruction of the monasteries, they petitioned both kings and said, could we keep our little chapel? But unfortunately, Edward VI said no. He took it off them and he gave it to a gentleman from London called Roberts, which proves that it isn't just now they're coming to take over West Country properties. They've always been doing it. And it wasn't until the middle of the 1500s that they were able to buy it back again. It's still maintained financially by the town today, and it's administered by 8 to 12 good men and true. You'll hear more about them later on. I want you to come up here with me now. I want to show you a couple of things here, which I love. Just look at these beautiful carved heads here. You can see where the atmosphere's got to them, but you can see how they've been spoiled over the years by the smog, probably started by the smoke from the foundries and then carried on to the present day, probably by all this traffic that's roaring through. But before we go into the church, I just want to take you round the corner, because whilst Mr. Roberts might have been given possession of the chapel, he wasn't given possession of this tower, and that presumably because in the tower was the curfew bell. In fact, it's still there today. Come round here, because just down this little lane is what's known as Curfew Cottage. And there it is, that tiny little cottage there, Curfew Cottage. And it's called Curfew Cottage for an obvious reason, because from this cottage, the curfew bell was rung. 4 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock in the evening. And it was rung because of an order from Elizabeth I. And for some reason here in Warminster, that order remained. It was never rescinded. And until 8 years ago, a little old lady used to live in here, and she used to toll the curfew bell every night at 8 o'clock. They omitted the 4 o'clock in the morning bit. And she used to do it by pulling the bell rope, which came down, as you can see, it's been covered in there, into the side of the house. It doesn't do it anymore because it was transferred to an automatic system up in the tower. Now, the man who worked out that automatic system is called Dave Pollard. He's waiting up in the bell tower for me. He not only looked after the curfew bell, he looked after the clock for this tower and the clocks for a great many other places here in Warminster. Fascinating man. Come and meet him. We always have to climb somewhere, I've noticed on this walk. Dave Pollard, I've just been talking about the curfew house and curfew bell, but the curfew bell is actually hung in this tower, isn't it?
Yeah, this is mainly above your head up there, and that was put in there way back in the 1500s. She's cast by John Lott, who lived across the other side of the town, who cast bells. It used to swing at one time as a ringing bell. They altered it and put a striking hammer on there with a rope that went from here through the wall and down to the curfew cottage.
It's almost impossible to believe that up to 8 years ago there was somebody ringing by hand a curfew bell somewhere in England.
Yeah, that was always, going back to before the last war, of course, it was also the fire bell. So that whenever there was a fire in town, one person was delegated to run to the chapel and grab hold of the rope hanging down into the church. There she goes, striking at 3 o'clock.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And really, you must feel very proud because maintaining this is now your work, isn't it, Dave?
Well, yeah, I maintain it and wind it every day, 365 days a year, because the weights only descend from the roof down into this room, and it will only run for 30 hours a time, so you've got to wind it every day. It keeps reasonably good time, within 2 or 3 minutes a day, subject to the weather, of course, altering the length of the pendulum. But it keeps very good time.
And it looks comparatively simple.
Well, it was always maintained by the clockmakers in the town, because there was a lot of clockmakers in the town back in the late 1700s, 1800s, when the town was reasonably prosperous.
The lovely thing, of course, about the men who've maintained this clock, they've carved their initials on the lintel there, so we'll know who they are for all time.
Yeah, graffiti, as we know it today, is a very good thing in those days, because all around the doorway in here, and also around the case, you've got all the clockmakers, when they probably stood up here waiting for something to happen or resetting it, either carved or wrote their initials and little notes all over the case, over the doors and all the way around. And I don't know if he was standing where you're standing, but O.B. Chambers, who was the last of the Chambers, wound this clock every day. And he came up here back in the 30s to wind it, and never returned to the shop. And so when they retraced his steps, he was found dead up here, having a heart attack, whilst he was winding the clock. So that's probably the ghost that walks around.
You've got a ghost here?
There's always a feeling that there's somebody here, especially at night.
And we've talked at great length about this clock. And I've got a feeling that people are going to write to me and say they've stood outside and looked up on the tower and they couldn't see any clock at all.
Well, you're not the first person to ever ask, why hasn't it got a face? But Danny Howell and I have discussed it many times, and no one knows why. We imagine that because the curfew struck at 4 and 8, and because the bell struck and you could hear the bell, and from 1850 the clock at Christchurch at the other end of town struck on the bell, there was no need to put a face on. So, but it is designed for a face, and I would imagine it's put in this position so it could have gone through the window to have a face.
They just never put one on?
No. And the clock was installed in 1765, but the 2 chiming bells for the quarter strike weren't installed until 10 years later. So it would appear that money was a bit tight, and they afforded this. The big bell, of course, was always there from the curfew, and the quarter strike bells took 10 years to save up for.
Dave, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. Oh, and thank the ghost for me, will you? Before leaving the chapel altogether, I think you ought to come inside and feel for yourselves the atmosphere of peace and relaxation there is within its walls. It has a most soothing quality. And then look at the carvings. I'm sure of the same period as those outside, but free of grime, they have retained all their freshness and charm. Warminster High Street as it looked in more dignified times, and a young man who knows a great deal about this town's past and present is local author and historian Danny Howell. That main street would have been a great trading centre during that corn trade, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Dealers would have come from miles around to buy the corn there. And again, Warminster being halfway, or exactly halfway, between the ports of Bristol and Southampton made us an ideal place for that kind of activity.
Because they could take their produce away to either port and bring, I imagine, goods in from these ports
as well. That's right,
yes.
that's right. It wasn't until the latter part of the 19th century that things began to tail off, as communications began to improve all around the country with canals and railways. That really put the death spell on Warminster as a corn market.
I imagine because of that corn trade, it became a town which virtually every other building, especially along that main street, was a public house.
Oh yes, I think it was about 43 pubs we had here at one time. One for every 90 people of the population.
And we've still got the one with the colonnade, where all the
old bell.
But there were others, weren't there, along that main street as well?
Yes, the Bath Arms and the Anchor opposite were the same. They had a colonnaded front on those too. which of course is where the corn dealers stood under there in the bad weather to do the deals.
But one of the great sadnesses, I think, about Warminster, particularly because of its traffic, is that people roar through it now in a car, or roar is not the right word, and all they see is all the vehicles, and they don't realise that if you go on either side of that road, down the lanes, it's quite a handsome little place still. It's retained a lot of that charm, hasn't it?
Once you get off the main street and you go down these side alleys and narrow places, some rather attractive cottages, and it's quiet. It's actually quiet.
Should you come to visit Warminster and you park in the main car park, which is over there, well, don't get out of your car and just rush straight up to the main street, but turn left, walk down to the playing fields down there. It used to be known as Beastleys. They used to hold the cattle fairs there in April and again in the autumn. And then come up what is now North Lane, but it used to be called Meeting House Lane for the very simple reason that here used to be the Nonconformist Meeting House. And it's called Dewey House today, named after an ex-councillor and school teacher. It was once a girls' school, as you can see. Today it belongs to Warminster Town Council. It very proudly displays its Doomsday plaque, but inside it displays some very lovely watercolours of old Warminster. They're well worth a look. They were painted by Louisa Wansley, and they illustrate quite clearly the charm and beauty of old Warminster. It must have been a delightful place to live and walk around, with many fine buildings and wonderful views of its surrounding countryside. Warminster also has a golf course with a 2-mile nature trail, and here I met Anne Sawyer of the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust.
Well, this nature trail is at its best between May and mid-July. It is an area of chalk downland, and so it supports the typical chalk downland flowers and the blue butterflies.
Because this wonderful sheltered valley we've walked through must be ideal.
Yes, on the steep slopes you find the greatest variety of downland flowers, and where it's sheltered, of course, is a haven for butterflies.
What particular plants and flowers can they expect to see?
Chalk milkwort, rock rose, scabious, yellowwort, many different typical downland species. Not a very great deal of bird life up on the top here, but quite a lot of different species in the wood, particularly in wintertime.
Any particular species that you could talk about?
Well, I'm not an ornithologist, and so I was very fortunate to have a bird recorder, but a skylark is seen up here over the down quite frequently. You get flocks of finches feeding on the beech mast in the woods in the wintertime.
Of course, you were telling me earlier that having a golf course within the confines of the trail is very, very good for you.
Yes, as you can appreciate, they mow the greens very frequently, but they leave the long grass alone. And they burn it off from time to time, but that is not in any way to the detriment of the wildlife.
For a short time in its history, Warminster boasted an industrial site with iron foundries, and Danny Howard conducted me around this now dilapidated area. Where would the foundry have been? Everywhere, more or less where we are?
All around us, the building at the top is really the central hub.
Yeah.
On the right here was the central hub of the activities, but eventually they spread out and took over most of the buildings here.
Now, who was Carson?
He was a Scotsman. He hailed from Galloway, and he came to Warminster about 1810. And 6 years later, with a local man, Henry Miller, they took over an existing iron foundry here. And they soon found themselves with a thriving business on their hands.
What were they making?
Oh, whatever people wanted them to make, really. Agricultural implements, doors, windows, ploughshares, you name it, they made it.
And are there examples of their work still in existence?
Yes, the gates and railings at the Nonconformist Cemetery at Bourne Road, they were made by Carson Miller in 1828. They're still in situ, and you can see the names Carson Miller and the date 1828 inscribed 6 times on the bases of the gateposts there.
Danny, up and down the Wylye Valley where I've been walking, I keep coming across metal graves. Some of them are quite elaborate. Were they all made here in Warminster?
I said earlier there were 3 foundries in Warminster, and to avoid competition, each one specialised in different things. And it was the foundry of William Dutch on the Bourne Road that specialised in making those coffin-shaped iron markers for graves.
Well, they must have been quite expensive.
They were really for the upper class people, and in fact the iron founder William Dutch has one marking his own grave at Sutton Veney.
And when did it all begin to come to a halt?
This particular foundry ceased to be about 1909. By that time, Warminster's corn market had long since come to an end, and so had the wool trade. Those 2 things brought the money into Warminster, and without that, things really fell flat here.
It all seems a bit of a mess, doesn't it, now, around here? Most of it derelict and obviously unused. Has it ever been used at all since the great foundry days?
Oh, since the foundry's demise, these buildings here have been used for a multitude of purposes. The town's electric light station set up here in 1922, and more recently the lower end was used as a place for the sale of tropical and ornamental fish.
Warminster must have gone through quite a bad time.
Yes, about 1900, Warminster hit the doldrums, and it was really nothing more than a dormitory town. And the town council at the time began to look to other ways to keep the town going. One of the things they looked to was tourism. There were lots of plans to build holiday villas and things like that.
And I imagine that the First World War and the Army's presence on the plain pulled it back together again.
It wasn't until the First World War that things began to pick up. We had about 35,000 troops under canvas at Cobford, and about another 35,000 troops at Longwich Devil. And of course that began to pick things up with regards to trade, you know, shopkeeping and things like that took off.
Warminster is a very nice town. Everything belonging to it is solid and good. There are no villainous gingerbread houses running up, no nasty, shabby, genteel people, no women traipsing about with showy gowns and dirty necks, no Jew-looking fellows with dandy coats, dirty shirts, and half heels to their shoes. A really nice and good town. Those totally unbiased words by William Cobbett must be the last we shall hear from him on this journey along the Wylye Valley. I have enjoyed his company, and indeed your own, very much. I've seen a lot that was fine, and some things in the name of progress that have made me very angry and sad. It is reasonable to say that the Wiltshire countryside along this valley is still in fair shape. The indigenous population, however, seems to be taking a battering, and there may be worse to come. On the credit side, the opening of part of the bypass recently has cleared Warminster's traffic problems, and when the entire route is open to Salisbury, it will benefit all the villages along the valley. I've had a lot of joy and pleasure on this journey, and I hope so have all of you. And I look forward to our next meeting in this glorious West Country of ours very much. Goodbye until then.